I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Reginald Dwayne Betts is a poet that I am so excited to talk about. And you guys know I don't do as much poetry on the show as maybe I would like. I've never formally studied poetry. I am a fan, though, and poetry is a huge part of my diet as a reader and a bookseller. It's just a way of staying grounded in language and story in a different way for me. And so, is this going to be a formal study today? No, but Reginald Dwayne Betts, who I am going to call Dwayne throughout this conversation, has a MacArthur Genius Grant. He's also a lawyer and a poet, which is not an obvious combination. We've had lawyers who are also novelists and lawyers who are memoirists, but poets not always. So, Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us on the show. And Doggerel. Doggerel is the new collection, and I am absolutely in love with this book. It is wild how great this book is.
Man, you got to yeah, I got to tell you, you're the first person in a long time actually that I've had like be interviewing me, and they say like I love your book, and that feeling I know is coming both from the book, but also from a sense of joy because this is
Oh,
the
yeah.
thing. The first book that I've ever written where like I knew that it had to communicate all of those things that you want a poem to do, but I wanted to show that even like maybe the pathway to singing is sorrow. At least sometimes it is, and it has been for me.
And that's one of the things I love about poetry. I mean, just as a reader, again, is simply this idea that you can cover so much ground and so much emotion in very few words. I mean, yes, some novels are meant to be 600 pages, and that's wonderful and that's great. Some novels are meant to be 150 pages, and that's great too. But poetry is a really distinct form. And you bounce between sort of very classical forms and also some things that I think are very you. You started studying poetry very young,
Yeah.
right?
And it's interesting though, because I love that you said I started studying poetry very young. Because in some ways, maybe what I started studying is storytelling. I'd offered the world a story to tell about myself, and it was me. I carjacked somebody, I was 16 years old, and that became a way to understand who I was. When I got sentenced, something made me ask myself, what will you be when you get out of prison? And I decided to be a writer. And the truth is, maybe I decided to be a writer because I wanted to tell a different story about myself. When I first got into poetry, I'm in solitary confinement, and I'm really enamored with the way in which this guy, Etheridge Knight, was able to write about prison, but make me think about my humanity, about wanting to be somebody. His first poem that I read by him was for Freckle-Faced Gerald, and it's riffing off of Baldwin's Another Country. And so he also made me think about what it meant to be an intellectual. But that poem was also in rhymed couplets. So it was making me think about form and meter and how you function as a sort of poet coming out of the old tradition, but recognizing some of these really important tools that you use. And so, I think about when I started to study poetry, and the truth is, I started to study literally in prison, but I started to study as a means to get me out of prison.
I understand all of that, but you also have a note at the end of Doggerel where you say, well, this brings me back to a point where not only did I start writing poetry, but I believed that poetry mattered. And, there are countless jokes about what does poetry do and what's the point and all of this other. There are many, many, many. We all have uncles at the dinner table who are going to be like, oh, hey, you got a bachelor's degree in poetry. Congratulations, kid. I do think, though, this idea of an oral storytelling tradition being handed down through poetry and being able to figure out who you are and what the next step is really exciting.
I mean, one of the things I do in Doggerel, and honestly, I mean, I think I would tell any young person this: don't let people tell you that you shouldn't be taken seriously or not to take yourself seriously. When you look at Doggerel, which I happen to have right here, I mean, these poems that open up the beginning of the book, I wrote those when I was in prison. And I happen to have a solo show that I hope some of your listeners, I happen to have a solo show that I hope some of your listeners and your viewers will have seen because it was on March 4th, the 20th anniversary of my release from prison. When I say that poetry saved my life, when I say that I am serious, I'm talking about the tangible way in which it allowed me to see the world differently. I'm talking about the real way in which it gave me tools to imagine that when I wanted to communicate well with others, I was learning how to think about something serious about myself. And also it gave me the man, I touched these poems that I wrote. I wrote these poems in 1999 as a teenager in a cell in solitary confinement. And it brought tears to my eyes knowing that I came from those poems to this. I mean, and that's what poetry does. And when people say poetry doesn't change anything in the world, I mean, that's just like saying ideas don't change anything in the world.
one of the things I really like about Doggerel too is that you they're two separate sets of father and son relationships. You have sons, and obviously you have your own dad, and watching sort of the evolution of what it means to be father and son for you on the page is it asks for more than one read. It really like I've read the book a couple of times now, and usually when I sit down to read anything, it's for cadence, it's for experience, it's for what does this mean and where does this fit into a larger. And the second time I go back, and then it's you stick on the language and the order of the poems and sort of the narrative arc of the collection. But I really do want to start with Fathers and Sons because it is masculinity is something that we are still kind of wrestling with right now in our society. And I think it all sort of starts with Fathers and Sons, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you don't think about this when you maybe. I feel like when I first started writing, I didn't necessarily think about the trajectory that I would be on and that I was on as a human being.
Okay.
And I found that this work was in the middle of a lot of changes in my life. I
Oh.
suddenly was like weeping publicly, you know.
Hmm.
And I mean, also I got a dog for the first time during the pandemic. Some of the things, some of my personal challenges, afforded me the opportunity to answer a question. Um, is it my desire and my need for my children to see a man that has no flaws and that has no vulnerabilities? Or is it my desire and my need to allow them to see the full bandwidth of a human being? You know, what's fascinating is that if you are a writer, like you live in a world in which people do want to idolize you. They want to say you came from jail to Yale, and they want you to be without blemish, without crack. They want you to be as stable. But that's not how the world works. And I found that these poems reflect me realizing that I don't have to be a rock.
Hmm.
That sometimes metaphors ruin us, and this notion that we need to be rocks forgets that rocks suffer. You know, that rocks take a beating. It is not that they are like, you know, without the ability to show how they hurt. In fact, rocks often specialize in revealing how they've been hurt. That's why they exist in so many different shapes. But we've taken it as a measure and a metaphor to be like not vulnerable. And this book reflects me living a life that has challenged me to ask what kind of man I want to be, what kind of human I want to be. And as much as it hurts to feel so much that it leaves you to weeping sometimes, I mean, it's given me a radically, wildly different relationship with my sons and a different proximity to joy. You know, it's weird to
Hmm.
say, but my proximity to feeling sorrow in the world has given me a much, much greater proximity to joy. Even if I'm just now a man with 8 rings on his fingers.
But, well, the rings are great. But also, I am one of those people who believes that you can't separate joy and sorrow, that they exist in the
Well,
same.
I'm gonna send you this speech just so that you
Okay.
know that I didn't steal your idea. And at first, like I got so Harvard, they let these Harvard professors give
Hmm.
the sort of talk at the Harvard Memorial every morning for prayer. One of these poems I had so I had went to my friends. I thank her in acknowledgments. I went to my friends to see my friend's granny. She was 100 years old.
Okay.
My friend says, yeah, if you tell Dwayne a word, he'll write you a poem. And Granny is blind. And she said, "Sweet Jesus." And I'm like, all right, man, I can't let blind Granny down. So I make up a poem, right?
Hmm.
Ooh, sweet Jesus. And the poem was premised around the verse Jesus wept. And so I
Yeah.
knew that when and I had been doing a lot of weeping in public, and I talk about it in the book.
Yep.
And everybody acts like I'm fragile or I'm vulnerable or I need to be rescued because I weep publicly. Because I weep publicly. But when I
Hmm.
was a 15-year-old kid sent to prison, there was not the same kind of alarm, even from people in my community, or they accepted that there was no rescuing me, right? And so what happens is I'm trying to write about the fact that just because I admit that I hurt does not mean that I need you to save me. And I'm thinking about Jesus wept, and then I'm doing some research. I'm like, oh, what's the other shortest line in the Bible? Is Jesus wept the shortest line? And it says, well, in the Greek, the original, the shortest line came from Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 16. Rejoice always. And I said, oh man, this is my word. And so I wrote this essay, 5 minute essay. And it's funny because when I got to the memorial, to the church, I was talking to this guy who was a poet, and I've been reading poems to everybody. So I was like, yo, let me read your poem before I go in. And it was on joy because he told me that his favorite poet was Chris Wyman. And years ago, I had read Chris Wyman's essay about reading Paradise Lost in a tree in Guatemala. And and he had cancer.
Okay.
And and see what happens is I wasn't really I wasn't into that kind of thing then, but I was enamored with the essay. And a friend of mine in 2019 told me that she had colorectal cancer. And I had been writing these poems, and the poems was always wrought with sorrow. They were about prison, but I felt like they were wrought with sorrow, or at least I felt like they didn't capture any joy. And so when she tells me that, I decided to write her a poem every time she got to go to chemo. And the whole point was that if I'm writing a poem for you, you're going to chemo, it got to be more than just suffering. So those poems became redaction, but the point is, it became a different way of me thinking about the world and about poetry. And I could read a poem to you on the street, any poem in Doggerel, because I know I was imagining what would it mean to read this poem to somebody I love who's going through something. And so I read this poem to this kid, and it's on joy. And as I read it, I start weeping because the poem is like, I'm talking about suffering. So you asked me how I'm doing. And I realized there are not enough words for joy in this language. Not like in the German where man can whisper a phrase for, it felt like a stone falling from my heart. And I'm reading this and I start weeping because I realized that the speech that I had wrote was actually trying to capture in prose the book that I have written. And the poem was like the opening statement in the case that I want to make before the world that like we can recognize sorrow and live in joy. And so for 5 minutes, I got on at the pulpit and I talked about weeping. And I said, people ask me why I'm weeping so much. And I want to ask them, why am I not weeping more? Why did I not weep when I reached into my pocket to get a homeless man money and I came up empty? Why did I weep? Why did I not weep at the birth of my children? So anyway, I like that you said that because it connected me to a whole lot of things that's running through the poetry and running through like who I'm trying to be in the world right now.
I also really love that particular I mean, there's also a line in there about in prison, a letter is called a kite, which, I mean, that's an image that, like, how do you even let go of that? And then if you could also argue that poems are kites, right? Like, and you've
Yeah.
been doing this project recently as we've been coming into the publication of Doggerel and past the publication of Doggerel, that you've been reading poems to your Uber driver. You've been reading poems to people on the, and I love the idea of creating a space where poetry is just an everyday art, right? Like there, okay, so long time ago, I was introduced to sort of the formal study of poetry with Thanatopsis.
Mm.
Beautiful poem. As an adult, I appreciate it much more than as a 15-year-old. But the idea that we can have a living art attached to a living poet walking around on the street and just, I mean, wait, where did I just see you were just in Amsterdam? I think,
Yeah.
and reading. And I was like, this is a great idea because also, I mean, yes, people speak Dutch, but English is common enough in Amsterdam. And but I love the idea of you just whipping out the book and being like, well, here we go. And then you record it and you throw it up on the internet. And this is when the internet is not a terrible place, in my opinion.
Man, no, for real. My new newsletter that I hope people sign up for is called Random Acts of Poetry. And I mean, look, and this came out of a class that I taught at Harvard because the
Uh-huh.
intention was to be like, yo, you've studied this in school. How can I make this live in your world? And how do I challenge myself? If I say certain poems are good, that means that like your family should like those poems. And also you should give your family permission to just like a line. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? And what does it mean to be able to deliver that? Deliver that line. Come and celebrate with me every day. Something has tried to kill me and it's failed. And I mean, it even works if you can't even remember the line. It's a Nikki Giovanni line. And it changed my life reading poetry in prison. But it's a line by her that I always re-remember slightly askance. I always think, and they will never know that love is wealth. And I know, it's a slight change in the actual line, but poetry invites the listener to hold it in his soul in a way that you need it. So that notion that they will never understand that love is wealth, that's what Nikki Giovanni taught me, right? And I think that's what living with poetry out loud does. And so people have loved it. I mean, I've read to like everybody, and it's been great, especially if you just come off the dome with it. They say, I'm a poet, and be like, well, let me hear something, and I say, my liver awash in all but the dregs, and then you do something to show that it ain't in your head. They'd be like, man, what?
Mm-hmm.
So good. I've been loving doing it.
I think we should get a lot of people to do it as much as possible.
Well, I made my students do it. That's a part of the class. Literally, the students to go into the community. I had one kid and one student. She went to Grand Central and
Oh,
Belmont,
wow.
straight public. You know, I mean, it's been. I'm starting a movement. I'm literally starting a movement that we are going to, and it's cool because it also teaches you about consent. You go up
Yeah.
to somebody, you ask them for permission. Do you mind if I read you a poem? And then as the poet, it teaches you like when audience, you value audience. Like, look, I got Bella song. If I want to read you Bella song, I say, look, can I read you a poem? And I'm telling you something. I wrote it for my girl, and it's gonna last like 6 minutes. You know, you gotta give them that prep. But if it's like 90 seconds that you tell them, and you get them prepared for what they're gonna hear, and then they can respond and such. And some of these things I learned by making, like one time, somebody, I don't believe I did this. I heard somebody on the phone talking about their dog had passed, or their friend's dog had died. I said, yo, put it on speaker. I don't even know the dude. I just met the dude minutes ago. He says, I said, man, put the phone on speaker. And he's like, I said, no, look, I want to read y'all this poem. Trust me, I think y'all dig it. So he puts me on speaker. Yo, this stranger I don't really know, he heard you talk about your dog dying, and so now he wants to be on speaker. I read this poem I wrote for my friend called Grief.
Yeah.
And by the time I got to the end, the dude gasped and was like, yo, you wrote that? Man, thank you. And I get it. Like I was intrusive. I was actually stepping into a moment that they were sharing that was emotional. But I felt like poetry mattered in that moment, and I would risk them thinking unkindly of me and
Mm-hmm.
ungenerously of me. And I would walk away accepting that because I know in some ways I deserved it. But I wanted the shot that a poem would matter. It mattered, man. And it's something to believe something like that.
And you studied with Cave Canem, which is an amazing, amazing poetry workshop out of Baltimore. So does Cave Canem come before your MFA in between?
100%. Yeah, I
Okay.
got out of prison. I got out of prison in 2005, but I got out late to apply for Cave Canem. And so when I found out that I had missed the deadline, I remember telling them, the person that answered the phone, Miss Myers, I said, no, that's okay. I get in next year. And she's like, it's really difficult. It's only 4 spaces. I said, wow. Well, I guess y'all got 3 left.
You were 24 then, right?
I was 24. Yeah. I came out March 4th, 2005. So, and then I applied again in 2006 before the deadline. And I got in and I went to summer 2006. I mean, I remember meeting Sonia Sanchez, Rita Dove,
Yeah.
Far Weaver, Lucille Clifton. I remember meeting Elizabeth Alexander. I mean, for
Mhm.
me, writers were like superheroes. And I
Yeah.
met these people who I had read their works. I wept the first time I met Lucille Clifton. That was the first time I had wept really since my second day, getting locked up. I mean, since I've cried twice in prison. So since
Okay.
my first MLK day was the second time I cried in prison because I was struck by the fact that I had wasted my life. It was hard for me to listen to everything that Black folks had through in this country,
Mhm.
and like my act of protest was the prison. Like, no, that's. And then I came home and I met Lucille Clifton, and I just couldn't believe that I was meeting a woman who reminded me that every day something had tried to kill me and it failed. But yeah, Comic-Con was deeply meaningful for me. I met a lot of my good friends. I met a lot of my best friends, John Mario, Randall Horton, people who stood beside me during my wedding and everything that happened after. And I watched a lot of people become like really brilliant writers. Listen Prize winners, Tyehimba Jess.
Olio. I pulled out my copy of Olio when I was prepping for. There are two other. I pulled out the Ferguson report, Nicole Sealey's redacted poems, and Olio because there's a kinship there. I feel like with Doggerel. I mean, obviously the redacted poems in Redaction, but also there are 4 in Felon too. But I sort of felt like you were in conversation in a way with them.
It's a line from Leadbelly from Tyehimba. It's called from this poem called Freedom.
Yeah.
freedom is what you could buy with a song, with the whiskey, and then at another point, it's like with the whiskey still in my voice. And it's interesting because I feel like much of my life has been trying to animate that notion. Freedom is what you could buy with a song. And in terms of me, Nicole, I mean, one, we all came through. Tyehimba was like working at Comic Con. I mean, he had already, I think, been there.
Oh,
He had already been there as a poet, and he was basically faculty. And then, but Nicole, we were there at the same time, and John Mario, we were there at the same time. I mean, it's literally family. I mean, the two of them are married, you know what I mean? And also, I mean, I literally remember sending Shaheed reads his own poem to John when it was in manuscript form, and I was doing guzzles, but I wasn't fully following the form. He's like, man, if you do it, you might as well do it all the way. And he's the one that pushed me to get as technically precise as I could. And so I think of these guys who have been really supportive of me as an artist and as a writer, but also when we talk about masculinity and vulnerability. I mean, one of the things that you need is a support system of people who do stand in the gap for you. And I think about a couple guys that's writers like Randall Horton and John Murillo. And I actually mention them because we think about writing and artists being community, and you know that your James Baldwins and that your Richard Wrights, they needed that to sustain themselves, that your Maya Angelou's, these folks needed that. And I think often in my life, I don't know if I've gotten a chance to have those conversations about when I was suffering from the worst depression of my life. I could call Randall like every day if that's what I needed. And that, like John was just through here in my neighborhood the other day, and we were sitting down and just kicking it. And it was so that part of the work and the work that's necessary to bridge, I think you want a person's life to be able to go from felon to dog. And this is a part of what it means to be a human in the world, and more than what it means to be a writer. And so the things that got me from Felon to Doggerel is all of these relationships, including with like collaborators like Titus, Kaphar. So it is powerful to be able to like talk about masculinity in the context of a number of men who helped guide me, but then also kick it back and think about people like, you mentioned Nicole, and then I would say, dozens of other writers who both in their work and in their lives, from Lucille Clifton to the Nikki Giovanni's, but also contemporary writers that we mentioned and that we might mention, like Honore Jeffers, or
yeah,
like
I love her work. There's a new essay collection coming, and I'm parsing it out so it
oh,
doesn't
word,
end. Oh,
word.
yeah, it's coming this summer.
Her book is in the Freedom Library. Well, I don't talk that much about the books that's in the Freedom Library, but her novel, Love Song for W.E.B. Du Bois, is one
Yep.
of the few that actually stretches from the antebellum period to the 80s, and it raises different kind of questions within the Black community. Or like Rachel Eliza Griffiths, who is another person that's doing well in multiple genres. These are people who, you don't think about yourself. It's both arrogant and humbling to think about. Doggerel is basically my sixth book, and I didn't realize it, but I am amongst a real community of writers, and I do like to consider myself. I hope I'm living up to the legacy. I mean, these guys are far, Elizabeth, Rita. I mean, I've read these folks in prison, yo, and to understand what that means is kind of mind-boggling. To be like, I am talking to you about a book that I published, knowing that this book begins with things I wrote in solitary confinement.
I'm going to add two more writers who actually are not poets, but I think you also know them in real life, Kiese Lehman and Mitchell Jackson, two guys that I happen to really
Yeah.
love the work of. I love their novels, I love their memoirs, but they are also, and I'm tossing them in here, also as a point of reference for folks who might not quite be fully up to speed with the poetry. And it's just, here's another point of entry, right? Like these guys and the way they write about the world and masculinity. And also Mitchell did time in on the West Coast. But the way they talk about being in their bodies and being in the world and how they express emotion and also, I mean, I like their cultural criticism. I mean, they are very funny, smart guys.
Also, I mean, also Mitchell, I'm giving him a running, but he got a longer history as one of the most fashionable people
Oh,
in the
I
literary
can't even.
world.
Yeah.
But I'm working on it though. I think, I'm working on it. I'm coming in the close 88th right now, but I'm trying to get into the top 50. But what I would say though is I remember reading Residue years and being so
Yeah.
enamored with the book that I brought Mitchell to Yale to give a talk with me. And we think
Hmm.
about writers and the ways in which they influence you, and frequently they influence you in multiple ways. And one of the ways that Mitchell influenced me was literally by having me be more willing to bring my son around and hear my story. Because Mitchell was like, yo, my kid knows everything about me. When I was like, yo, you know that we're going to be talking about prison. So that was cool. And then I did several events with Kiese. I mean, I taught him, before I met him in person. And when Felon came out, we were on the road together. So that was
Hmm.
great. And thinking about our work actually functioning as like cultural criticism and leading to a kind of cultural criticism. But I'm really excited about my relationship with folks across genres. I asked Kiese to write about my book, Felon, because I wanted people to write about it who weren't poets. Not that I didn't care about what poets thought, but I really was trying to find different ways to make sure I was talking to the world.
It's part of what gets me excited actually about Felon and Doggerel and having them out there is they are accessible to people who may not necessarily reach for poetry first. And that's when I get really excited where it's like, well, yeah, we have fans of poetry and that's great. But also, an NAACP Image Award is kind of a nice way for folks to be introduced to Felon who might not necessarily think of poetry first when they're looking for something to read.
And look, man, I do albums these days. In April, it's going to be at least one or two of the tracks because I turned Dog into an album. It's sort of like a love album. It's called Petrichor, but like Solstice, I made a real straight song out of Solstice, not no like poem set to music. Even though I do that too, but no, this is like rocking out with a bridge, with a chorus. You know what I mean? So I'm really trying to create something special for people.
Well, you've done the stage show, you're making the albums. There was Redaction as the art show, not just the book itself is physically gorgeous, but there was an art show to go with it. So you're working across all of these media as well, but you're also a PhD student. And I don't understand how you are pursuing a PhD and you're teaching poetry and you're doing all of this creative work. And, you also have a family and all of this. All right, how? How is this all happening and you're still walking the dog?
Yeah, no, honestly, the PhD is all but dissertation, which means that, I was in the middle of trying to finish a PhD. I thought that the world was going to be my study and I was going to be my study and that it wasn't going to finish. And I started Freedom Reads and Freedom Reads, man, I was in a moment where I really did. I resented maybe myself. I thought I was making everything about myself. I was I was challenged in some real ways. And then I've had a lot of changes in my life. And what happened was I think anybody who goes to prison trying to figure out a way to make up for it and to be something different. But then the more successful you get, I think sometimes you might think you don't deserve it, right? And and I got really sad in maybe June 2023. I stopped drinking and not drinking completely, but I think I had spent a lot of time drinking as a way to allow for my inability to sleep. And also for my inability to understand how my brain was working and deal with the frustration that I often caused the people in my life. I mean, you say something like it's great how many different things you do, but I think it was time that people love me might have been like, Dwayne, when will you do just one thing? Like I thought you was getting an MFA to teach poetry. And it's like, all right, well, you're going to law school. So you're going to law school to be a lawyer. It's like, what do you mean you writing long form articles for the New York Times? What? Why do you want to do a solo show? And these things that are amazing and have gave me a really fulfilling life, like didn't always sit well with how I was trying to build a life that was a supportive, you know, husband, father, human being. And so some of the ways that I've learned to do all of it though is that I never felt like I could fit in any of those categories anyway. So I had to push and push and push and develop a multiple set of skills that wildly allow me to work on 5 or 6 or 7 projects at once. And they come out, they sometimes they come out 3 at a time, 5 at a time, but they've been being worked on for like years. And and I don't sleep, actually, I don't sleep. But also I gave a lot of like, you got your electives. Going to
Yeah.
prison meant that all I had was electives.
Okay.
And I developed a bunch of skills that kind of suited me for the kind of intellect that I have and the person I wanted in the world. And then getting, I mean, I got with my wife, my ex-wife. Yeah, no insult to her either. It's just that I got out of prison, we got together, and was married for 15 years. And in that relationship, it was challenging but it was great in a lot of ways because I was centrally motivated towards taking care of my family. That might have me jumping around doing this thing, and that thing, but at least like I was centered on them and my world. I was able to focus so much more, do so much more planning and building the kind of intellect and mind that is needed to do all of the things I do now because I got out of prison, which was really constrained and self-contained, and I became a husband and a father, which was really contained and self-constrained. Even though I had wild freedom because I was a writer and I was an author. I hope that makes sense. You know what I mean?
It does make sense because all of those pieces come back to story, right? Like on a much smaller scale, the one thing I've learned doing in the 3 years or however many years we've been doing the show is that I should have done more independent study when I was younger. It turns out I really like rabbit holes and I like going.
No, I think my next book is gonna be about ADHD. You know, I mean, see, it explains so much in my life, and I wish I
Right.
would have known it before. You know, you'd be like, well, wait, name one thing it explains. And let me tell you how I started studying in law in prison.
Okay.
Somebody says to me, Dwayne, if you go to McDonald's and you slip and fall, my sale partner, it's like, Shy, if you go to McDonald's and you slip and fall, can you sue McDonald's? And I'm like, what if, do they got one of those things up to tell you if it's wet on the ground? They said, yeah, they got one of those up. And it's their fault that I slipped? Yeah, it's their fault. Of course I could sue. Did I get hurt? Yeah, you broke your leg. Of course I could sue. We argue for 30 minutes, right? Then he goes into his locker where you keep all your property. And he takes
Right.
out a book that belonged to him that he had read before. And he opens up the book and turns to a page that is marked. And the book is called Torts. Now, the problem with this is that he has proven that I'm wrong.
Uh-huh.
But the profound problem with this is that he asked me a question he knew the answer to and proceeded to talk to me for 25 minutes about it. So I take this magazine he had called Prison Legal News and I start to read it. And I see paralegal course in the top right corner. I have looked at this magazine 1,000 times. I have never cared about a paralegal course. I said, I'm going to take a paralegal course and nobody's going to know more about the law than me. That has me taking a paralegal course. Years later, I'm in Harvard. I'm just there at the Radcliffe Fellowship, writing poetry. We would go into the Harvard Law School's cafeteria, right? Me and Uzo Awela, because we both.
Oh, I love
So
that
he,
guy. He's
so he could verify.
great.
He could verify you this story because he is at the center of this story. We
Okay.
go right there. I'm working on Bastards of the Reagan era. He's working on other kind of people.
Yep.
And we would go there because nobody would point us out and acknowledge us. We could just be, anonymous. Somebody says, Uzo. He's ignoring the person because he's trying to be anonymous. So yeah, I think she's talking to you. He said, nah, I don't know anybody here. She taps him on the shoulder, Uzo. He's like, yo, what are you doing here?
That's a very Uzo story.
Worse, watch this, but wait, it gets worse.
Okay.
He says, I thought you was getting your MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Why are you here? She says, oh, I finished up there, and I thought I'm not finished school yet. Already she's my kind of people. I'm not finished school yet. I was thinking, should I get a PhD or go to law school?
Right.
I decided to go to law school.
Right.
And in that moment, I decided to go to law school. I went home. I told my wife, I said, yo, I figured it out. Because I had been incapable of getting a job. I had two
Right.
jobs I applied for in Boston. One place said I sounded too much like a professor. And the other place said, even though I told them I'd been locked up, I was trying to teach in the inner city schools. I used that as a hook. They said, yeah, we can't get your background check yet. I was like, but I told you what it says. And I wrote a book.
Right.
So my back was already against the wall. I literally said, I'm going to go to law school because this woman said she went. And I was like, yo, you got it in Harvard too? I know you might be smarter than me, but now I feel like I'm going. And so I was trying to figure out, and I was talking to various healthcare professionals. My mom just found one of my third grade report cards, and it said, Reginald is really smart. He does his work on time quickly, efficiently, but he has a problem. He wants to manage other people, even adults. It's
Wait.
like,
How old are we in the third grade? 8?
no, because I went to school early. My birthday's in November. So I was literally like 7. I was 4. I was 4 in the first grade, you know.
Okay. Okay.
And,
so
I literally might have been 6 years old, 6 or 7, something crazy like that.
But you end up going to Yale Law School.
I did.
You go to Yale Law School, you sit for the bar in 17, you pass the bar. And then the state of Connecticut says, well, yeah, we know you've done all of this, but there is this felony conviction, and we're not sure that you have, wait for it, the character to be a lawyer.
And that was fascinating partly because it's not that I begrudge the need to check into somebody's character, to have a conversation with somebody. I, I applied to it was University of Chicago Law School, and I got a call from their dean of admissions, and he said, "Yeah, I see your application. I just want to call you, get a sense of who you are." And I started saying something. He was like, "Nah, I've read all of that. I just wanted to talk to you. You do know you got an interesting background." I was like, "You mean?" He's like, "Yeah, if you want to go ahead and put it flat like that." And I'm just kind of, what else have you been doing with your life?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I coach basketball. I ran a book club in the community. I started talking to him about some of the things I had done. That's, and the next day I got admitted. Oh, and then he talked to me about if I had a plan on on this character fitness question.
Right.
And he talked to me about what would happen in Chicago. And the next day I got admitted. So it has never been that I felt like people don't have a right to ask me questions or, it's just, and being forgiven doesn't mean like having to live your life and never be questioned.
Right.
I just felt like in the state of Connecticut, there was no thing that anybody could go to and understand what was being asked of me, understand like was it going to be a public hearing, have some sense of what standard that I had to meet. And the real challenge is to live through this life and have no clue
Mm-hmm.
what you need to do to be. It's so hard to even say it because I'm not trying to make this about me. It might need to be myself. But when people talk about accountability, there's often not a clear understanding of what we mean when we say accountable. I think most of us tend to mean suffering when we say accountable. We want you to be accountable tends to equate that we want you to suffer. And and it's hard, man, to sometimes live in a world in a situation like that to not know what I needed to do. And what I had to do was reveal, I had to get my friends to write these letters. And it was powerful, but it was frightening. It was sad. It made me realize something. Most people who love you, they never get the chance or the opportunity to tell you exactly why. Because sometimes it is private. It is private even to you. It wasn't like for them to tell you why you matter. And all of these people had to reveal to the court like intimate things about our relationship that I didn't even know. And it was kind of sad that, I mean, it was great. I was like, I'm a great dude. But it was like, I know this person would have wanted to tell me this in a different way.
Freedom and forgiveness, though, are two of the threads that run through Doggerel. I mean, they run through all of your work, but I'm going to stick with Doggerel here for a second. And they really, the intersection of freedom and forgiveness, right? Which comes first? Do you get the freedom from the forgiveness, or do you get the forgiveness from the freedom? And there's this great poem in the new collection in Doggerel called Jethro's Corner.
Oh,
And there are two lines. And I'm pulling it out from this is not the opening of the poem. It sits sort of in the first set of stanzas. To plot freedom is to leave the words that matter written across everything you own that matters. As in, leave the names that your loves call you, all the places that you traverse. And it's just like, oh, that, again, like, does freedom come first? Does forgiveness come first? Does forgiveness come first? Or can you separate them at all? Or do they run on parallel tracks for all of us?
I almost think they have to because I think sometimes, you are free even when you aren't forgiven, and you are forgiven when you're free. But also the ways in which, that thing happens, it is like when they say I contain multitudes. I mean, I think that the I is in Reginald Dwayne Betts contains multitudes. But I think the I is in our community, the voices I write from in poems contain multitudes. And I think when we're in community with each other, we still grappling with those multitudes. And sometimes there's a version of me that is forgiven because I show up and I am loving and I am beautiful. But then sometimes like the version of me that you remember is not that. And I can't begrudge you for not seeing me as I am now. That's the thing, man. It's like we think that it's on us and that we get to have control over the version of us that people hold dearest to their sight. And I think if we admitted that, man, we don't get to control that, maybe we would have more grace for people who don't forgive us. And that's why when you say what comes first, I think part of the question is who is the person that has the power? And maybe that's what we got to focus on more, because we can choose to forgive first.
I mean, I go back and forth. I don't think they can be separated. I genuinely, I think sometimes forgiveness is the thing that you actually do for yourself. And then you figure out where to go from there. I mean, I don't have a perfect answer. I like the idea that I can sit with poetry and I can sort of noodle an idea.
But think about this, the forgiveness and that gets to be rooted in yourself, right? But you could give somebody freedom. Like I could tell you, listen, it's good. And you do not have to worry about what you owe me. That apology was enough. Or what you did was enough. But the reality is if the forgiveness comes from you, you might still carry it forever. And that's kind of what I mean. Is like, and I think about it, it's like, because you could give somebody forgiveness and still hold them, you can still treat them like I forgive you. But then all the time you bringing up something. I had this situation where when I was a kid, right, I burned my mother's carpet and I act like I didn't know how it happened. And so for years, I was like, Mom, I don't know what happened, And she says, it is not a big deal. It's not a carpet, it's just and she recently found out that one of my friends did it. And now, we all friends now, right? And my mom loves my friend, right? My mom is like, all the time. So you owe me a carpet. She's forgiven me. She has not given me freedom from that story. She will
Right.
tell it for the rest of our life. She'd be like, no, I finally found out who burned my carpet. So that's the thing. Maybe that's what I mean. Like, freedom is like giving somebody permission to not let it weigh them down anymore. And I think we can say that, like, as far as it goes with me, you ain't never got to think about that $1,000 that you ain't give me on my birthday after you said you was, and I missed the Reginald Dwayne Betts show. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing, right? You could give somebody that freedom, but to forgive. Anyway, poetry's beautiful because we can have a 15-minute like back and forth on freedom and forgiveness, and think about it in the context of Jethro's poem, which is really about a black man owning land that became Yale, and what does it mean for him to be free?
Mm-hmm.
Actually him to forgive the institution,
Right.
So anyway, thank you for pointing that poem out. I really like it, and it's one of those things that I knew if I did it well, I felt like I'm a poet.
It feels really formal in an old school way, and
I've been hating.
I was not expecting it where it popped up in Doggerel. I was like, huh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. And I mean, honestly, I have read it more than once out of the context of the readings that I did prepping for the show, just because, yeah, I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't expecting it. It felt very sort of old school, and it's all good. But it was not quite what I was expecting from what I had experienced of Felon and Shahid reads his own poem and Bastards of the Reagan era. And I mean, really, I have read all of the books. And here it is just popping up in the middle of Doggerel.
The Atlantic picked it up, and that was
Yeah.
really beautiful because you never expect them to pick up a poem like that too.
Right.
I'm gonna read a piece of it to you if you don't mind.
Yeah, please. No, that would be excellent. That would be really excellent.
Jethro's Corner. 1. Maps. The corner of Ashland and York, and it's sometimes when the only evidence is a map. The disappearing English of old plat, a funky word that exists most in memory, meant to make a plan or map of, to draw to scale, to plot. A man who cannot read coordinates can still plot on his freedom. Imagine a rectangle on the oldest map in these 9 squares of geography, once called the wilderness. Quinnipiac, Pequot, Pawcasset. To plot freedom is to leave the words that matter written across everything you own that matters. As in, leave the names your loves call you, all the places that you traverse. As in, to name is to announce worthy of remembrance. 2. Some evidence of this life is always measured by the weight of La Llorona's weeping. Jethro, 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 owed his name. Left this world owed his name. Who enters heaven owed their name. Who enters nameless. Historical catalog of the members of the First Church of Christ in New Haven, Connecticut, AD 1639 to 1914. Compiled by Franklin Bowditch Dexter. Catalog of members 1726 to 28. May 15th. Member 875, Patience, daughter of Caleb and Mary, born March 1699. Member 876, Mary Atwater Dickerman. Member 877, Experience Perkins Gilbert. Number 878, Jethro, Luke, colored. Franklin knew his name enough to count him more than 3/5. To list his surname and call him colored, to be counted and named, the fourth member whose lineage included a slave ship. The first non-European with a surname listed, an Old English variant for happenstance, for luck, which in the land of Patton is a variant for the word irony, for deliverance. Think Luke of the gospel, Luke the liberator, Luke as English variant of Lucas, Lucius, bright light for a plot listed in a corner of a map. Jethro Luke was colored, cast in shadows of manacles, or, in the parlance of Marx and Pareto, Jethro was old, left owning little beyond whatever he held when his eyes searched the freedom of a night sky. Brown coat, old great coat, brown jacket, white jacket, one check shirt, black stocking, old axe, small tongs, old gun barrel, great Bible, 8 round bottles, candlestick, old mare, pair of oxen, plowshare. 3. Freedom is one way to name this story. Sometimes only maps be evidence. In 1748, a corner mark confesses, Jethro, a black man father, corner of Ashman and York, a small city park, Catter cornered to the Grove Street Cemetery, and all the freedom not permitted to rest there. Jethro, Ruth, Manuel, Sampson, Betty, Joe, Jenny, Mango, Sanders, Sabina, Sybil, Phyllis, Dina, Pedro, Sumi, Pompey, Gad, Rose, Rhoda, Phyllis, Pompey, Williams, Newport, Amasa, Silva, Caesar, Rose, Cato, Leah, Socorro, Peter, Alice, Little, George, Jack, York, Pressy, Polly, Caesar, Peter, Simeon, Joseph, Bristol, Phyllis, Dina, Cambridge, Primus, Amy, Thomas.
I love that poem so much. I love that poem so much. The names matter. Naming the emotions and the people and the experiences and the time and the space and the place and the map. It all, love.
I didn't even know if I would be able to read the whole thing, right? And what's cool is like, even as I started reading, I thought, oh, man, this is good.
Yeah, it is.
If I could get through the whole thing. And I thought, man, and my whole goal was to have this pastiche almost as an archival document, because the archival, he's the one that created this. His name is Moran. It's an archivist at Yale. But he went to all of it and he pieced the story together through the records. So like me as a poet, I'm trying to turn it into one song, but to get to the one song, you had the scholar had to pull it from several sources. And I like to think about that as when I say I contain multitudes, trying to create a song out of the multitudes.
Which you did. This entire Doggerel is such a joy and a pleasure to read, and it is impossibly thoughtful. And again, I love the idea that you're walking around in the world just reading these poems.
Did you read the it's interesting, did you read the galley and the final book, or just?
I've read the galley. The final landed just as I was coming downstairs. So the final is my treat to myself.
I'm gonna read to you the last poem that I finished for the book.
Yes, please.
If you look at the galley, you'll look at bike ride and you'll see
Yep.
that it's a mistake in the galley. And part of bike ride, no, look at guns, dogs, and heroin. And you'll
Yep.
see that the end of bike ride is basically put on the end of that poem. And it's just a mistake.
Oh.
Now go to the acknowledgments.
Yep.
And you'll see there's a point where I say, and the Uber driver, the
Yep.
nice young dude, you'll read what I say there. Didn't I say something like, I still owe you a poem?
Yes. And that's the poem.
But what happens is I found that mistake. So this says so in this one, her poem is in this one, because I found that mistake and I changed the poem immediately to this. And I got it in the book at the 24th hour. So I would love to ask
Yes.
you in the all right.
Please.
Guns, dogs, and heroin, but not gin. Not because of judgment or how some seduction reduces us all to a mistress of common sense, but because the smell of gin ain't funky enough. Not the guttural need that follows any get down or birthday. You know, one of them walking in the rain funky days. So not for the sadness, but for the joy of more. And the corn above says this world notices something other than me. And then boom, I'm back on a Pettis Bridge, barefoot in another downpour. On the other side, a woman adjustment waits to return me to near memorial that stretches across so many acres of green, with its 800 giant cordon monuments falling from the sky. Surnames, if known, of a black person lynched that needs United States carved in the steel, all for this legacy of survival we carry with our breath. And the two blue ribbons tatted behind this woman's ear, the J's with a dragon leaping from the tongue on her arm, and her waiting as I walk, chaotic, across a bridge on a day that would have been Rosa Parks' 111th birthday, testify to all the ways we come to know each other. And as I turn to see the deadly, I stare down the fall that will foreshorten the life of a fallen God. And I remember Bloody Sunday, how back then, even facing snarling, they'd held fast to their Sunday mornings. And maybe this is what the older couple remembers. The two I turn to see walking just a pace behind what I've become. A man barefoot and weeping in the rain. And they step without talking, but they're as if to tell me as I walk that today, a day of raindrops, August, whatever men lost their seed desire when they fear drowning.
So, wait. I would be totally happy to end an episode on you reading a poem, but freedom. We need to talk about Freedom Reads. You're the CEO of this really great foundation, and you do some very cool work. And I just really, can we get a sort of riff before we go?
You know, I should have said this from the beginning. I've been talking about Freedom Reads this whole time. You know, I talked about Kaphar. Kaphar and my relationship came in prison. I first read DJ Renegade in a Callaloo journal. And I read those poets and learned about Kaphar. And so when I was thinking about, somebody asked me, what can you do? Like if money wasn't an issue, what would you do about the issues you care most about? And I knew they was talking about the penitentiary. And I said, we put millions of people inside. I'll put millions of books inside. Really, because I know that what books allow you to do is build community. And we make our books, the library is a Freedom Library, is 3 bookcases made out of hardwood, beautifully carved, hand carved here in our office spaces in Connecticut. And we ship them, and it's a specially curated 500 book collection. But it's a library, and by library, what we mean is it activates the environment. It brings joy just by being a physical intervention in like what is just concrete and steel. But it also brings joy by bringing in other writers. I mean, Terrence Hayes has been inside. You know, Jacqueline Woodson has been inside. Willie Perdomo, Tim Siebels. I mean, we had a run of writers that have come inside that have appeared on our podcast. Miriam Taves has appeared on the podcast talking about her book, Women Talking. And we had Jamie McBride that appeared on the podcast. And so what we've been able to do is create a community of writers that can be in community with those in prison. We sent thousands. At this point, we built over 400 Freedom Libraries across 14 prisons in 13 states. And I do believe that freedom begins with a book. I mean, my freedom began with a book. Thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
And that does seem like a good place to end, because freedom does begin with a book. So Reginald Dwayne Betts, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Doggerel is out now.
Cool. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Hello, readers, and happy Poetry Month. This is the TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic poetry collections to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Doggerel. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, but I'm going to have my book buddy Donald in Detroit kick things off today. Donald, what do you have for us?
Hi, everybody. Hi, Mark. This is Poetry Month, and I can't contain the excitement that I have around this month every year because I'm a poet myself, and I think it's actually an art form that doesn't always get the love it deserves, but yet is one of the most powerful and impactful art forms that we have. And so with Doggerel, really looking at hundreds of different poets that I could have picked. Hey, I could have even been pushing my own book, right? But really what I chose was one that talked very simply about the connections that we have with the natural world. And much like in Doggerel, that idea of who we are as a person and our identity, but how we also fit into the world. So Mary Oliver's Devotions is the one I looked at. Now, she has a poetry collection called Dog Songs. That right there was enough of a connection. But here we're really looking at a whole swath of her career, which at the end of the day really deals with the natural world and how we fit into it and how that world helps protect us as much as we should be protecting it. Countless readers know about her brilliant crafted verse and her love of the physical world, but the bonds that she talks about in these poems, a lot of them are really short, punchy, almost like haiku, really, in the fewest words possible, can be gut-wrenching, can be very to the point and very raw and brutal at times, while also just maintaining that sense of humanity in the poems, as well as the beauty that we sometimes take for granted. I think I got a lot of that out of Doggerel as well, as just the experience that those poems have and how they tie to the author really speaks a lot to what we see outside of our own personal issues and traumas, and really looking at how everything around us, even our work environments, even our home environments, really are the balance between how we understand who we are and how we find our place in a world that is so much larger than we ever could imagine. And so Mary Oliver has done that with precision and beautiful, beautiful language. So pick up Devotions or any of her poetry books. Frankly, just pick up a poetry book this month and read one. Even if you've never read poetry before, I'm telling you, it's an art form that we really could be embracing at this time with everything we're going through, and really fall in love with something short and punchy to get us through those moments. They're as inspiring as reading, an affirmation or a psalm. Like, just jump into a book of poetry. Mark, what do you have for us?
I could not agree more. These are magic spells that we could all use right now. So I wanted to celebrate Poetry Month by choosing a current favorite that was thrust into my hands by a bookseller a few months back. I think she actually physically ran at me with the book and said, "You need this now." And that is Crush by Richard Sicken. And damn it, she was right. This is a collection that aches and thrashes and allures. It is absolutely stunning and so slim and powerful. Sicken writes about desire like no one else I've read before. His sentences are very crisp. They're very potent and often troubling, but always, always honest. I think that he really has been able to figure out how to tell the absolute truth in a way that reaches deep down past shame, that crusty layer of shame. He's able to kind of dig just past that and pull out a perfect description in a way that anybody can connect to. This is a savage collection, but it's so, so, so lovely. It is soft and prickly and just all of the things. It's really, really fantastic stuff, and I think more folks should be reading his work. But please start with Crush. It is tremendous, and that is by Richard Sicken. But guess what? That's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. And Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow my store at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Go out and get some poetry in your life. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.